Most association leaders aren't avoiding AI, they're kind of overwhelmed by it. The tools are multiplying, the pressure is real, and the path from we should do something to actual results isn't always that clear. In this episode of the Microlearning Lab, Carlos Cardenas, Senior Strategic Consultant from Delcor, Board President of Association Latinos, cuts through the noise. We talk about what separates organizations that see real ROI from AI from those still stuck in the pilot mode, why implementation strategy matters more than the tools itself, and how even small staff teams can move forward without massive budgets or technical expertise. So if your organization is ready to move beyond the conversation and start seeing real results, this one's worth your time. Now let's start the conversation. Hey everybody, Erick Prospero here with the Microlearning Lab. Today we're talking to Carlos Cardenas. He is the Senior Strategic Consultant with Delcor. He's the Board President of Association Latinos, and we're going to be discussing how associations can move beyond AI hype and start treating AI as a strategic asset, using it for measurable results, smarter operations, as well as being a leader in their space. So Carlos, can you tell us a little more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I appreciate the opportunity to, tell my story and then share my perspective on artificial intelligence, right? And again, I think, it's not a surprise it's here. We've got to figure out how to leverage it. But as you said, my name is Carlos Cardenas. I am the current board president of Association Latinos. I'm also a senior strategic consultant at Delcor Technology Solutions. Born and raised in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood. Joined the Marine Corps when I was 19 years old, got out, joined again after 9/11, started my own, consultancy shop, got my foot in the door at an MSP, got introduced to the association world, and I have not left since. So that's a quick introduction. Again, thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful, Carlos. Now, I know I'm starting to notice a lot of AI fatigue, right? I'm sure you're seeing that as well with the conversations, but the reality is the world is changing, and it's changing at a very fast pace. So we have to embrace this technology. And one of the first questions I wanted to ask you was, where do you see AI actually driving real impact in associations today, as opposed to just pilots or experiments, but real measurable outcomes?
Yeah, and I think it's easy just to take a step back and pause on that initial reaction to your question. AI fatigue is happening because organizations are not realizing, right, the full potential of, the promises of AI. I think at a personal level, you might say that there is a return on that investment, but at the organizational level, not so much, right? So, and I guess I just want to set that as the foundation, to answer your question. What are organizations doing now to fully realize the capabilities? I think number one is embracing it. You mentioned that earlier in our conversation, but I think embracing it and trying to figure out how to empower not just yourself as the individual, but your team and your leaders and the organization in general. If you can figure that out, and if again people take their signals and their cues from leaders, you set the example, you set the tone. You make people feel, welcome for experimenting. You give them permission, to do so. I think that sets the tone. And then have a plan, right? So not just here are the tools and I'm buying licenses for everybody, but we're, leadership has taken a step back and we're, evaluating and assessing. And this is the plan. It's not perfect, but we've got to start somewhere. We cannot be left behind. And this is a two-way conversation, right? So you are boots on the ground. You're going to be using these tools. We need to have a method, a form, a process, to collect that feedback. I think those are two key things. Rather than chasing the tools, the bright and shiny, which I know a lot of people do that, and I did that myself. And in the beginning, taking that step back and saying, like, what is it that we are trying to accomplish here? Aligning it to business goals, outcome-based, experimentation and learning. I think you'll have a much higher success rate than, not having anything. But at this point, you cannot be focused on we don't have a policy and therefore we stop there. That can no longer be an excuse. You've got to figure out a way, even using AI, to create it. So long-winded, answer to your question. And I think we can dig into more concrete examples as the conversation goes.
Love it. And I do like the point you're making about the differentiation between personal use and business use, right? Because almost everyone we talk to or I talk to, right, they're using it on a personal basis, right? I use it for cooking, I use it for gardening, I use it for absolutely everything. But I can see how if you're running, at least from my perspective, running a learning department, there might be restrictions or hesitations or even small preferences. And we've seen the same issue where I was just at a conference, it was the Professional Development Committee for ASAE for their Learning by Association event. And there was two themes that came up. First one is we don't have capacity. Second one was I'm kind of tired of talking about AI. And the funny thing is there's like a solution in the second one for the first one. So I love the point you're making about tying it to business goals, and I'm a big fan of leaning into it to expand professional capacity. Now, why is AI adoption still lagging in the association space compared to other sectors?
I think historically, right, AI, it's almost like an inside joke. Association, technology teams are lacking. We're behind the curve, right? And ha ha ha. But I think if you dig deeper, I think you'll start to realize that, a large percentage of associations are small staff associations, revenues of $1 million or, $500,000 or less. And so again, it's a resource constraint. And so how could you possibly go full throttle, on some of these, emerging technologies, AI, if you don't have the resources, you're wearing multiple hats, you're firefighting. So I think that's one of the bigger problems. I think the other, realization as you talk to people and organizations and leaders about these things is that, they can help augment, the work that you do. And so, again, just to take a step back again and say, like, where are we at and where are we going? So small staff, 10 staff members or less, you're getting hit. The expectations of your members are increasing. They're using these tools. They're asking you more sophisticated questions. You're being bombarded, with all this information. Again, AI fatigue is one of them. But member expectations and demands is another one of that. So how can you possibly meet that expectation, right? I call it the cognitive ceiling. And so a normal human brain can only absorb, a certain amount of information, and there's research on this. And so how do you deal with that, right? You either burn out, and I guess run in the sink or swim analogy, or you use some of these tools to augment. So again, we have to think about an intelligent way of using these tools. And again, I think it starts at the small staff as an example. And as your organizations, get bigger, then you need to think about, what does that technology team need to, is it the same as the same blueprint as before, or does it need to evolve and adapt? I would argue that it needs to evolve and adapt, to AI. It's not just disrupting the individual, the organization, it is disrupting architectures and infrastructure.
Definitely. No, I like the approach, and I can see it's funny because there's no blanket term for associations, right? There's associations that are ran by management companies, there's small staff associations, and then you have these huge, large budget groups that have years of credibility, a huge budget, larger teams, and of course it's going to be a different approach. And I've heard that before too. It's a capacity issue. Like, how am I going to spend time to learn about this tool to actually use it to solve my problems? And it's funny because the tool that's supposed to be solving capacity problems, you can't learn about because you have capacity issues. And it's almost like, honestly, I would argue that it's almost a professional development concern, right? Like, you have to spend some time sharpening the axe. Otherwise you're working with blunt tools, blunt resources that aren't usable in today's world.
Yeah, I want one quick example. An executive at a conference and said exactly what you just said, right? How do I make time to learn, about I don't have time for these tools, right? And so I feel like there's an inversely proportional relationship between how busy you are and the least amount of time, right, that you have to learn. And I guess again, that realization is you can balance some of those things, right? As you start to develop that AI muscle, that intuition, to start helping you take stuff off of your plate, so to speak. So again, I think all of those things are related, and I'm happy to be talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know my bias is tied to professional development, right? I mean, in my mind, it's easy. I was like, I've my background's professional development. I'm a trainer, online trainer, and I see this as almost as a training issue, right? Are you gonna set aside time for your staff, for yourself, to build your skills? And even without AI into the conversation, like it's on us to become better, faster, more efficient at the individual level, and of course at the organizational level. Now, what are some of the big mistakes that you're seeing associations make with AI right now? I know it's easy to say we should use it, we should learn about it, but what should we avoid doing?
I think the biggest mistakes are, and I mentioned, right, chasing the tools and not having a strategy around it. And so again, it's you've got organizations who say everybody gets a license, and it's not outcome focused or based. And so if you have no goals, right, no measurable goals, like how do you define and measure success? You can't. You'll make it up after the fact. We did this, and I think that sounds, what success looks like. Whereas if you have that plan, you have that strategy, you can align to those business goals, then you can say after X number of months or X number of years, did we achieve the outcomes we set out to, or did we not? Success and failure is more easily measurable, right? And you can always adapt and pivot throughout that. I think the biggest mistake, and I might even say in general, and not tied to associations, again, is just, I think it's the infrastructure, right? And so there are countless number of articles that say, 95% of organizations, 90+% of organizations are not seeing the ROI in their AI investments. And I think trying to figure out how to adapt that technology to outdated infrastructure, methodologies. One example, right? So, we've got a knowledge repository, file server, right? You might say digital workplace management, SharePoint, taxonomy, folders that a human, is used to looking at. These AI tools, they don't need that taxonomy, right? They can index all that information. They can apply tags to it, right? So while we're chasing to figure out how to build the next intranet or SharePoint environment, we should be really thinking about how do we build that intelligence layer? How do we reimagine how we structure that organizational information to then translate into organizational intelligence? So again, just thinking about the infrastructure of old versus how do we need to adapt and evolve our infrastructure, to align best with, the capabilities of that these AI tools offer and deliver.
That's interesting. I know. Can you speak to that? Can you speak to that a little more? Just because I know there's going to be a lot of listeners who aren't necessarily coming from a tech background, right? Like, what does that mean in terms of aligning the infrastructure in a way that works for them, that produces measurable results, that saves them time? Like, can you give me an example of, okay, if you fix this, this is the type of output you could have?
Yeah, I guess, I don't mean to lose people and with like technical jargon, so thanks for keeping me honest there. I would say that, in terms of that SharePoint environment example that I gave, you might structure that information a little bit differently, and rather than having that, top level root folder and then all of the, subsequent level folders below that, you might structure big buckets, big categories, and then dump your information there. And again, this assumes you might have access to a co-pilot environment, right? I think for the most part, associations are geared more towards like Microsoft
Microsoft.
365. And so if you've got Copilot, you probably already use Teams. You already have SharePoint with your license. And so again, naturally, you would gravitate towards that. So just what I mean in terms of curating the information to be able to make it more accessible. And it doesn't mean just dump everything in a folder, right? You've got to go through the process of, an archival or document retention policy. Do we really want to go back 20 years or should we set a limit of, the last 5 years? There's got to be a filtration process to say, let's get rid of the final versions of these documents, right? And like, let's put the true form. And not only do we stop the bleeding, if I could use that analogy, but we also, create a process where new information follows that. So you're not cleaning up the mess, over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. That way you're not just dumping a lot of information, training a model with things that are older processes, not necessarily useful. And you want whichever AI tool to have the most up-to-date systems content. So it's actually practical in terms of what you're doing. Yeah, I gotcha. That makes sense, because in my mind, I typically thinking from an instructional design perspective. So the equivalent for the learning departments at associations would be going through your instructional material, making sure that your files, your documents are up to date. There's not necessarily anything that you wouldn't want or that would be an IP risk. But with that being said, a lot of these models, especially Copilot, it's pretty safe, right? You could assume that they're not stealing your data. They're very protected there.
Yeah, I think at the 365 level, depending on the license, none of I think you can opt in, right, for your most basic level, free level, to share with future training of the model. But if it follows all of the same enterprise level security, encryption, as you would expect at 365. And so it is segmented, it is isolated. You are not sharing, beyond your environment, and you are not, training future models. I would also say what we just touched on is inside the organization, right? And then the other part is outside the organization for your members. And so again, what does that look like? Future state, and maybe that's another conversation, but I think serving inside the organization, inside strategy, and then outside the organization strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if there's a tool or resource that you're developing for a membership base, right? And there's
Yes.
no reason why you shouldn't be, right? In the past, something of value would be a lead magnet, right? An article. Now, everyone has ability to develop applications, codes, resources a lot faster with vibe coding. So that's an interesting point that, hey, we should be providing AI solutions for our industries, right, as association leaders. And I wanted to bring up the point that you made about, okay, setting a standard, not just buying a bunch of subscriptions, because I can see how that's a solution, right? Hey, look, we're leaning into this. We got a bunch of we have access to these tools without actual follow through, right? Without measuring what happens. I know one of the things that we've done from our side was we set high standards for expected output. So once we realized, okay, we can use AI specifically on this workflow, the output expectations were changed. So typically an instructional designer developing a course would take, let's just say 40 hours of research studying for 1 hour of content. And that's how we would budget for a course, right? And I mean, those are ballpark figures, but as soon as we realized, all right, with this workflow, we should expect this type of efficiency, we set that as the standard, right? Like, so if you're an AI enhanced instructional designer and the project doesn't have any IP risks, you should be producing content this much quicker. And if you're not, there's a problem with how you're working, right? You're not using the technology, you're not using a modern process. So we were, we almost made it mandatory for the projects that allowed for it to happen. Because I mean, honestly, our customers are expecting it, right? Our clients want us to be leaning into the technology. They're paying us for, I'm starting to realize that we have to be the ones that are leading, like walking, because consultants can always move faster, right? We're smaller organizations. It's a lot easier for us to adapt. Our policies are a lot more friendly. Usually we're a little more aligned with tech. And so it's easier for us to lead the conversation, show them what's possible, and then show them what doesn't work as well. With that being said, I know a lot of association leaders are still going through the process of working with different tools. How should they evaluate AI tools and opportunities without getting pulled into the hype? Like, do you have a process on where they could start? Like, how can they measure something that actually works, or what's your workflow there?
I like to think about like an AI readiness assessment, and that could be in the form of a survey. And again, just trying to get an understanding, taking the temperature, right, the distribution of your staff's AI aptitude, appetite, you might even say, and then also thinking about surfacing maybe some operational challenges inside the organization. And so starting there, that gives you a benchmark of where people are, and you can ask different questions in terms of what's your role, how long have you been with the organization, do you consider yourself a power user, or have you never used it? Are there environmental concerns around AI? Or if you could use AI to solve one problem, what would that be? So now I think you can use that as, leadership can use that as intelligence to say, now I have some data, now I have the distribution, of people's AI readiness, aptitude. Now I can deliver a more tailored plan, from where to start. And again, make no mistake, use whatever tools you have available to you. If you do not have, if you're not a 365 tenant, if you're in Google, well then look at Gemini. If you are in neither, if you're, I don't know where you would be if you're not using those, but use the tools that are readily available. Don't let it wander too far off, because, again, you have to now think about bringing that information back and exporting from, whatever environment. Obviously have a policy in place where you have, strict governance to say, like, you are not putting XYZ member information into these platforms under no circumstance, and it has to have teeth, right? You can't just say that here's the policy and like go find it and we never talk about it. I think that you're looking for failure, and you're looking for things to kind of fall through the cracks. But I think the other part is continue to have these conversations at the leadership level, and then also with your staff. The more that you talk about it, the more that they see you're engaged, the more that you encourage them, the more that they're gonna go and explore these tools themselves, the more that they're gonna collaborate with their colleagues, right, to try to problem solve, which is what you want, right? You can't put yourself in the middle of all of these things, but go out and scout, try to figure out a way, use your brain, right, to figure out how to problem solve some of these things. Bring that to us, talk about it. We'll have a showcase, to talk about some of these things. So again, starting from zero is probably where a good majority of associations are right now. I think it's shrinking, right, in terms of the number of associations that haven't even dipped their toes into AI. But starting from zero, that's kind of the playbook that I would recommend, following.
It's funny, while you're talking, I realized I should have done or followed your AI survey idea. And I bring this up because again, I mentioned our organization, we're a little more aggressive with it. We have a younger team, and it was easy for us to say, look, let's build up some competency, then we can set up a policy and start using it right away, and everyone has to use it. But then while we were going through the experimentation process, trying different things out, our art director quit. And one of the reasons why was he wasn't excited about using AI. And I mean, this was a year and a half ago, and I still remember his name, Alvin. He didn't say anything, and we just assumed, the guy's going to be open to it, but he was very protective about his work, and he had a certain bias on it, and which I get, right? There's a lot of people who are even Gen Z, actually. I've heard Gen Z is very anti-AI, that just aren't going to use it or aren't going to be excited about it. And so a survey would have identified that, right? We could have at least seen, like, there's certain employees that aren't drinking the Kool-Aid the same way we are, right?
I would say that, an anonymous survey is probably the best, right, to get, accurate feedback. versus if my name is on it, I'm probably not going to tell you what I really think about it because I know the boss is looking at it. So, you have to figure out a way to get what you need, but then also protecting, I guess, the people that are, being honest and upfront and truthful to their responses.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe set up like a volunteer thing. Like if you want to be involved in this type of experiment, reach out after we do the anonymous survey, because at least we would have known, hey, there was heavy resistance. We figured there'd be some, but not leave your job resistance, right? And again, things work out. We ended up building up a team that was very AI friendly, that even designers that are incredibly talented that can draw and put together the most incredible things. We have some people that are leaning into the tech and they're using it. And I like the way she phrased it. Like she's getting really good at controlling it, right? It's a system of control for the tool that she has. But and the other point I wanted to call out was not just having a policy, but a policy with teeth. Because it's easy to document something and say, this is the policy, don't do this. But then what are the repercussions if you're taking IP that's critical and loading it to the system, right? Like, what does it mean? And having that conversation, because I mean, policies can be useless if it's behind a desk somewhere. Nobody, one, is aware of it, but then also nobody's scared of any type of consequence if you go against the policy.
Yeah, I think the other part of that is, again, having teeth. What does that even mean? What does that look like? You're probably not monitoring these tools. You think of free versus paid tools, and Delcor did a webinar about this, and like, what's the difference, right? If I need to start somewhere, do I start with free and there's a trade-off there, versus if I start with the paid tools, what are the security blankets, right, you might say, that I can enjoy from that? And part of that, again, is having these conversations that are not going to be shared outside of that particular environment, are not going to be fed. And so if you do not have any type of policy, or if free is your, tool of choice, we like to say associations have a competitive advantage because your content is member created. If you only use free tools, then there's going to be a slow leak from that member created information. And so again, it just speaks to what's your competitive advantage as an organization. And why would an organization come to you if you have that slow leak versus going to a ChatGPT or Claude to get a response in 10 seconds? So it's like we're in a new world. You have to think about the competitive advantage. What's your competitive moat? And how are you competing with these tools?
No, that's a good point. And I'm starting to hear a lot more organizations lean into using these content development tools in a safe way, at least with IP, but they see their competitive advantage as they are the authority that approves it, right? So content developments become significantly easier, right? You can go to, our learners can go to ChatGPT, or the people who are creating to the content are using these LLM tools, and they're realizing, okay, content creation is no longer the issue. Now it's how do we verify, make sure it's good, and protect our brand as the authority, right? And I can see that being something AI isn't going to have for a while, right? And if AI ever becomes the authority, it's going to be kind of weird, right? Like it's going to be a weird world we live in.
Yeah, I think the other part of that, and just to dig deeper into that, just because we are being supportive and we've got a policy and it has teeth and we're encouraging, that doesn't mean that we just mass produce AI slop, right? So again, there has to be some sort of gateway filter before it gets in front of your leadership, before it gets in front of your members. Again, it's just there's a proliferation of AI slop on social media, right? And there's it's almost like a game guessing, who's doing that. But that's something that leaders need to pay attention to and need to have those conversations and need to build that muscle so that there is some integrity in what you're putting out to the public and to your members.
100% agree. Just more along the lines of, we no longer have to worry about producing a lot of content, because that used to be the constraint. Now, how do we filter this so we're producing things that actually matter, right? We're not just creating noise, dumping content out there. And under that philosophy, I think it just leans into, okay, are you using AI to make the content faster or just better? Because it should be both, right? Like, you should have a better result. You should have better data. You should have you should use, I mean, it's not like you're going to use the time that you're saving to not do anything, right? Like it should be a legitimate, better value for the membership base that you're using it for, as opposed to, oh yeah, we got it done faster.
Yeah, I would also say that it doesn't necessarily need to stay at the tactical level. There's a strategic layer that AI can provide as well. And so not just necessarily go do this for me, but help me think about, some of these things in terms of a strategy, and help me think about a plan, a framework, an approach. So there are layers to this. And so I feel like, again, back to maybe a question that you asked before, starting from zero, or, this is just a way to think about the multi-layered, approach to AI. And so not a whole lot of organizations at the strategic layer right now. A lot of are in the tactical, making things faster, individuals faster, not the organization faster.
Love it. Now, onto that point, I know this is the last question we have. So what's going to separate the associations that use or successfully adopt AI over the next 1 to 2 years versus the ones that fall behind?
I think, just to tie it back to some of the things that we had said before, all of the above. But I also think in terms of, meeting the membership, I guess, demands, inquiries, expectations, membership models, I think, are at risk. So I think the organization, and then I think understanding, your future members and how they may be brought up AI first, right? So your, teens right now, their brains are being developed with AI first mentality. And so again, once they reach, the age of being a member, will you be ready for them? So you have to think about that as well. And then again, I feel like it goes back to the architecture. I would even say your future members might be agents, right? It's like I now you have this agentic economy, and I can go and pay for an agent to do XYZ for me, and it's going to go to your website. And again, reimagining the website, I think we've talked about that before. It's not going to be necessarily a human, and this is a ways away, but it could be an agent scraping your website, looking for information, giving me back a summary, right? And so the agent is doing all the work. What's the engagement, in the future? So that's a little bit of a futuristic. I like to think about where all of these things go and what do we need to do to prepare. What separates, associations that will successfully adopt? Again, inaction is not an option at this point. You don't have to have a huge reserve in terms of, in making these investments. I think you can start small. I like to say small but mighty are going to be the ones that make the most impact. And so again, based on that competitive advantage, you may have a competitor association. So how do you compete, right? I think members have choices in the marketplace. Why would they come to you versus going to somebody else? What are you giving them, that's different? So, again, I think zooming in, and I would even say using these AI tools to rethink, the member journey, the member value, behavioral signals in terms of what they interact with. We like to say engagement scores, but I think that's only part of the picture. People say they want something, but their behaviors tell you something else. So using these systems to be able to think about things a little bit differently. Have a little bit of an electrical engineering background, and so digital signal processing, right? And so behavior economics, behavior science, thinking about why people make choices and setting the trap to measure that, and then figure out what do I do with that? Who is at risk, right? What bucket of members are in that risk, of what do I need to do, to turn that around and not just chase them, 30 days before expiration, which again, I think research shows that if you don't engage them within the first 90 days, onboarding, orientation, they're gone. Foregone conclusion. So again, just thinking about some of these things and just thinking about how AI can augment, work in parallel with you, not replace you. That's another conversation, right? In terms of the human in the loop. How long will that last before we have our trust increases and we take ourselves out of that loop? I don't think we're too far off. to your original question, you've gotta jump in. You can't sit on the sidelines.
Absolutely. I love the framing that you had that was future oriented, right? I mean, we tend to think about ourselves, right? Like people like us that are doing what we're doing, but these teenagers that grew up with it, they're 10 years away from being in the active workforce, right? Being a huge part of the membership base, the agents. So it's almost scary to see how things are going to change and evolve. But again, that's more reason to not sit on the sideline and be passive, right? The game is changing, so are we. So, Carlos, thank you so much for the time on the call today. What's one of the best ways for people to reach out to you? I know you're doing different things with Delcor, Association Latinos, but is LinkedIn a good way for people to get in contact if they have any questions?
Yeah, you can reach me on LinkedIn. So if you want to connect, you may offer that URL. LinkedIn.com, I think it's /in/Semper Wi-Fi. I like to dabble in amateur photography as well, so semperwifi.com, digital photography. But I'm primarily on LinkedIn, so if you've got a question, if you want to chat, put some time on my calendar, let's dig into it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carlos.
Want to learn more about micro-learning best practices? We've got you covered. Check out the video cards for more related content. Don't forget to subscribe for weekly tips and explore the description for a curated list of resources to continue your e-learning journey.